Hajime!
Greetings and salutations, Legionaries. This is another episode of the War Room Transmission. Today I'm joined here, obviously this is General Lance, joined here by a very special galactic strategos named Claw, and he has, he's an author and a writer of science fiction, and he has 2 books, which we will elucidate in due time. But in the meantime, welcome, Claw.
What's up, man? What's up, Lance?
Hey, how you doing, brother? It's been a while.
Good.
I know that we've been trying to get on the transmission here for a long time, but unfortunately I've been forward deployed in a tropical clime battling commies, so it's been in the way, you know. And I know that you've been seafaring along the stars here, so we finally were able to make the same port of entry and record this transmission. So I really appreciate you taking the time. But first things first, I came across you a long time ago, and, you know, I'm always on the search for good literature in general, but science fiction has always been a big thing of mine. And I came across basically Gemini of the Sleeping Gods, and I remember reading it just because it was a suggested thing on the Amazon, and I was like, wow, this is like, looks kind of cool, the cover's kind of cool. And then, you know, of course, I'm reading through it, and I'm like, oh, this is cool. And then it's like, oh, shit, this is awesome. And then basically it gets to the end, and lo and behold, there's a secondary book to it. It's Mind Saturnine. And in effect, I kind of got a lot of good vibes from it, and of course we'll talk about the substance of this book and the kind of world, the universe, the world building that you engaged with it. But before I kind of get into it any deeper, I wanted to ask you, just kind of give the Legionaries out there the overarching theme and the idea of the story that you're trying to write for us. Because from what I understand, you have a third one in the works, right, in this trilogy?
Yeah, there's going to be 6 or 7 books total.
Oh, wow. Okay, well, perfect. I'm glad that I caught you way ahead of time. So just tell us about the story and tell us about, you know, what the overarching kind of arc of the story is meant to be, and we'll just kind of go from there.
Yeah, so thank you for that introduction. It's very, very eloquent. I'm actually surprised that you're saying that you found the recommended page on Amazon is crazy, because it's not a very well-known, like, so far my series is like, I have a core audience of people that have followed me from Twitter and were interested to see what I was writing. I've obviously published 2 other books that were nonfiction. They were more of like an esoteric novels, Goonhood and Passerilla, which are both basically like my attempt at like kind of like a philosophical, you know, philosophy with a hammer, essentially, is how I kind of like wrote them originally. And that was during COVID. So that was like 2020 through 20. I actually published the Passerilla a little bit later. I think I published it in 2023. But in the kind of the meantime, I've always been a huge, like, I've always loved science fiction, particularly more of the thought-provoking science fiction. I would say, like, my favorites probably would be like, I think the Dying Sun series by Jack Vance, and then of course I'm trying to think of the author's name is escaping me, but like, pretty much like anything military fantasy, I used to read, like, Bernard Cornwell. Of course, like, the big influences are Robert E. Howard and H.P. Lovecraft play a huge role for, like, basically the aesthetic influences of BASK. And then pretty much anything like that. I was reading a lot of around the COVID time. If you're asking kind of like what BASK is about, essentially the really boiled down version of it is BASK is a story of it's a science fiction. I've kind of coined the term, and I know I'm not the first one, like kind of science fantasy. There's really no boundary, I think, with like the fiction labels. It's essentially a story of like a fallen world, a sun that ends, kind of acts as a mortal engine, and essentially like the races of man and like kind of the forerunners or progenitors of man are kind of lost in their ways. They have remnants of their ancient and very advanced civilization left over, and the people that roam around them are essentially barbarians, tribals, humans that have no capabilities of technology. The philosophies around it, of course, go from like Friedrich Nietzsche to Oswald Spengler. I also take a lot of inspiration from like the Vedas, and essentially there's kind of a pagan undertone to it. There's a strong emphasis on the hubris of technology and where that leads us to. There's some I don't really like to dive into. I don't want this story to become anachronistic of our times today, but there certainly is like some influences with like AI and things that I've kind of put in my own science fiction sort of like a skin suit almost in the book. So there's some elements there that you could probably relate to a modern time, but it reads off like, I always tell people, it reads off like Conan the Barbarian meets Halo. It is, but it's much more than that. It's not just like people going around killing and aliens and things. I definitely have taken a lot of pages out of Jack Vance's book, and just kind of the relationship of man and technology is probably, I'd say, the number one. That's probably the underpinning or the spirit of BASK. So
that's great. And I mean, it's interesting because I guess, that is probably the quintessential, I guess, question of our time is effectively this, which is what is the relation of the technic with the soul? And how is it that the technic can be developed? Is this independent of us? Is this a reflection of us? And does this necessarily, I guess, does it disrupt the spiritual experience of man in time? Or is it something that we can synthesize into something greater? And of course, I mean, ever since man picked up a rock and used it as a lever or, a chisel, whatever it may be, this question likely had, been posed to man regarding, the future, what it means for us, and ultimately what it means for the progeny of our generation. Why I love science fiction is because what science fiction does is it allows the reader to mentally be beyond the framing of our time, and allows suppositions, especially in soft let's say science fiction. It allows for the reader to get at the moral or philosophical discussion, existential experience of man, without being encumbered or circumscribed by, the technical capacity of science to realize those goals. And what I mean by that necessarily is that, a lot of people, for instance, they consider a Heinlein or anyone else or Battlestar Galactica, and they're like, well, that's not very possible. That's not very realistic. You know what I mean? And the issue is that, when you're able to transport yourself outside of the paradigm of what's possible, you start to be able to engage with what is essentially the ideal, right? And so you're able to take moral / existential questions and develop them without having to worry about, estranging the audience from the realm of reality. You know what I'm saying? So, what I like about your book is that basically it already transports us to an environment which we just, take things as they are. And so we're able to engage it in a more kind of good faith exchange with the author. and engage with like the ideas and the themes of your book. Which for me, it seemed to me that like yes, it seems kind of post-apocalyptic in a way. But at the same time, there's an idealism and a vitalism to the story, which I feel like it's not a post-apocalyptic. It feels almost like an exaltation of what is actually the benefit of living and the heroic conquest of one's environment, regardless of what it may be. It's a world that is heroic and extends beyond simply the comfort loving material plenty of our time, especially. And I know that you didn't write it in context of our time, and you tried to make sure that it was its own standalone thing, but I feel like the connection really came to me because of the fact that it's like, well, who cares if America becomes materially impoverished during this cycle of our civilization? There is still, not still, but I think that the material benefit or prosperity actually hindered our spiritual experience and happiness, fulfillment, purpose in our life. So I just kind of wanted to ask you, as far as like your own personal vision of things, like how do you feel about the relationship between technology and man, material wealth and spiritual wealth, and those kinds of questions, which I feel like are kind of always undertones of the story that you wrote.
So I would say that that's a two-part question, because my own philosophies are only kind of, I don't want to use, I'm trying to think of the word, and if you can think of the word, remind me, because I'm just spacing today. It's just basically describing trying to inject one's personal philosophies into their writing, using the writing as like a vehicle or a vessel for it. That's not my intention at all with BASK. I think what you're talking about, like the vitalism, that definitely is something that it's a pretty powerful component, especially like kind of later on in the story. There's a certain kind of gravitas with I would say with a protagonist that takes on sort of an odyssey in later on. And the vitalism is very important because one of the main influences of BASK was Oswald Spengler. I have to preface this with, like, if anyone knows who Spengler is or is very versed in his writing, I am not an expert by any means. Please do not ask me a ton of questions about Spengler. I know like enough, and I really like his writing. I'm that kind of person where I don't have the time to sit down and listen to like an audiobook or read for hours and hours and hours. However, there was a trip I took to the desert where I listened to an audiobook of my first entrance to Spengler, which was Man and Technics. And I think it's Man and Technics or Man versus Technics. And I really enjoyed the book, and I reread it, I think, or re-listened to it about 3 or 4 times on the trip, because I really wanted to like absorb it. There was that part you mentioned, Technics, earlier on, that kind of like reminded me of this. But essentially, the big piece of BASK that from my philosophy is that like there's something called the machine culture that Spengler alludes to and talks about, which is the main thesis of Man and Technics, which is man has a technique for survival, and that technique is actually just another word. Technics is from the I don't know like the Greek root or anything, but it essentially means, like in layman's terms, it's man's like tactic, and the way they use machinery and technology in order for them to achieve dominance in their environment. That's a huge part of BASK. That literally was, before I wrote BASK, this is kind of like the progenitor to the idea that became BASK, which was that the technique is about the tactics of domination in the environment, is in sort of ways like not, I would say like a Darwinism, but the race of progenitors, the Godwalkers in BASK, are supposed to be representative of man who has essentially enslaved himself with his own technology. Spengler refers to this as kind of like there's like a bridge between like nature or Mother Nature and then the nature that man creates with his tools. And there's like that bridge gets longer and longer as time goes on and technology advances, where man is trying to essentially create their own. If you imagine nature as like a city, man is creating his own city aside from nature, trying to separate himself, and eventually that bridge collapses. So That's essentially what BASK is, where there's that other city, and that's like the ruins. And the way I want to describe it was, it's science fiction. If you're a barbarian, you're walking around and you see like these giant glass crystal ruins. You don't know what these are. They're completely foreign to you. They may glow red occasionally, or they may have some strange sounds or whatnot. And and I try to describe it in that way from their perspective in the books, because you would have no idea. So in that way, I kind of really try to focus on the sort of the catch-22 of technology, where that, and we're asking like the spiritual value or material wealth versus spiritual wealth. There's a lot of spiritual wealth in these sort of traditionalist structure barbarian societies in BASK, which are essentially the men that kind of escape the big experiments, and they like outlast these other races of people that are very technologically advanced, and their kind of vitality and their just raw survival skills allows them to be kind of the last ones left. But it's not, like you said, it's not post-apocalyptic. They're kind of wandering, trying to find. They're curious about what came before them, and it kind of spurs this entire saga of what happens when, essentially like almost like demigods mess with technology to the point where it almost leads to ruin. And yeah, there's definitely some post-apocalyptic elements to it. Although I would never classify it as post-apocalyptic. There's a sort of like, what would come from like a nuclear holocaust. I just don't focus on that sort of element like you see maybe like the Fallout genre, where in the Fallout IP, where it's like it almost fetishizes the post or the pre-nuclear America with a sort of injecting that with like a science fiction post-nuclear America. I don't really delve into that too much, but that's kind of the main thesis. But there is obviously the spiritualism is, I'd say again, like it's very pagan in BASK. But yeah, I don't really. I guess that's a long answer to your question, but I don't really. I think that the vitalism is probably the number one thing that I would say comes through in BASK, or that I wanted to see, which I believe in myself, which I'd say be very Nietzschean amidst a ruined world.
It's obviously it's not about the post-apocalyptic kind of situation there, and I completely understand, because the emphasis is different. Just to reiterate, Fallout, for those of you, I mean, who doesn't play Fallout or hasn't played Fallout, but the overarching tonality of that story, right, is effectively man trying to return to a technological plenty, generally speaking. And the converse of the attitude approaching these things is that, from the protagonist's point of view, in your stories, it's not necessarily about trying to return to this previous world. It's more like they're self-confident in who they are, self-confident in how they perceive the world. It's just a kind of Faustian curiosity, which is not a slavish, kind of blues trying to return to a risen world. And the way that I kind of think about it is like, the biblical parable of was it the Tower of Babylon, whatever it was called, but basically, God smites it down and scatters the people of the earth.
Tower of Babel, Tower of Babel.
Yeah, there you go. Tower of Babel. Thank you. Sorry. Yeah, I'm such a Philistine, but in a way, it's not as if the peoples of the Tower of Babel wanted it to be reconstructed. It's more like there's this like other nation of people who have experienced this post Tower of Babel environment, and they're just interested in knowing the people who still yearn for that, or the artifacts that are the repository of their experience with that. And so, it's interesting. So Man and Technics, and Spengler, in the Spenglerian sense, talks about technics and technology in such a way that's unique. He explains that the way in which technology is developed is unique to each civilization's, nation's perception of nature, right? And this is very Nietzschean in the sense that every nation is its own will to power. and holds one thing which is unique as its ultimate good. So, for instance, right, the Persians to shoot straight, tell the truth. The Germans to command and obedience. The Jews to respect mother and father, and so on and so forth. The Greeks, right, to excel above all others. And so, for me, the way that I kind of experienced the story was kind of like it was almost as if it were a barbarian anthropological interest in this past civilization, but without a wanting to, let's say, like replicate the past glories, so to speak, of that civilization, and ultimately they are themselves their own civilization, self-confident, self-affirming vision of life, which is kind of the coolest thing about it, right? The vitalism about it is that they're not self-doubting. They're not concerned with their lack. They're not concerned with their they're how do you say, they have their own vision of things, and it's completely independent of what they experience of cultures beyond, right?
Yeah, there's definitely like a lack of. That definitely was a huge factor for me, in the same way that Robert E. Howard was inspired by, like, his vision of Conan was essentially created by him being a kid in Central. I think it was like Central Texas. I don't know what part of Texas he was in. I've driven through a lot of Texas, and the way he describes Samaria is, I mean, I've driven through it at the same time, in like late fall, winter, with like the trees and the vultures and eagles kind of roaming above this kind of vast, kind of rough, raw wilderness. But he was inspired, like Conan came from the idea of like an oil field worker, kind of like a brute of a person that doesn't want for a life in, say, like New York or Chicago in the early 1900s, right, but is content with being this kind of barbaric, sharp-witted, roughneck, savage, out in Texas, basically being kind of a little of a menace in whatever local area they go to work on the oil fields. But there are barbarians in BASK that do end up trying to yearn for that. I mean, that's with the Saturnon. That's where I came up with them. And actually, I pulled up my old notes, and I literally have this sentence that says Saturnon, and then in parentheses says, "No one is safe from technology / dying sun. Wizards are shitheads." And that literally is where I came up with that, like, for the second book. And some people, the one thing I kind of worried about when I wrote it was I was worried that people would they would kind of really enjoy the first book, and then they would get to the second book and they would think, this is a completely different story. What is this author doing? This is crazy. Which, by the way, I mean, I have my writing name, what I go by is Clausen. But in the BASK series, I wrote as Hyperfant. And I don't know what my reasoning was for that. I think I just kind of wanted to try to write something with absolutely no identity whatsoever outside of the actual piece and just see how it could take off. I kind of pushed it on my Twitter and whatnot, and then that's where a lot of my audience suddenly gravitated and realized that I'd written this book as a complete anonymous person. But yeah, the second book was completely supposed to be. There's a whole track of, I would say, kind of like a subplot that becomes the main plot in book 3, that 1 and 2 kind of allude to. I don't really want to give out too many hints about what it is, but it becomes later on more of like the spiritual arc of the story, more of like a biblical sort of inspired fallen angel sort of arc that comes on later. And that's where, like, book 2, I kind of needed a vehicle for that. And the Saturnon just kind of made sense. I just had this kind of idea of where, like, maybe there are some barbarians that do kind of want for, maybe they have hubris. They want to see if they can replicate what happened before, or they think they're smarter than everyone else. And so they end up enslaving, the rest of the barbarians or whatnot, or the rest of man, and try to ascend. And of course, if you read book 2, then you see what happens with them. But
right, I don't want to give away too many spoilers, but what I enjoy what I enjoy about your book or your series is that the following is that I can already sense that it's the threads of the book are not it's not monolithic, right? So it's not a progression of one story per se, right? The idea is that if in effect it is it's dynamic in the sense that it has multiple actors. It is a world building unto itself, and in itself, it's requisite of these multiple different, let's say, factions, philosophies, interplaying against each other. And it's interesting because I mean, it really is a reflection of reality itself. Especially because you and I we were I guess born and raised in the West, and there is really just a unitary understanding of the good, that there is just basically one set of values and experience of life, and yet that's completely untrue. And I mean, if you read, for instance, the ancient classical authors, especially Herodotus, and his experience of like foreign cultures like the Scythians and let's say the North Africans and the Indians and so on, about the exotic nature of their kind of interplay between cultures, and to say nothing, of course, that even within the greater Hellenic world, the customs and values would vary widely between city-states, even between very geographically proximate locations would have very different cultural destinations, if that makes sense. And what I enjoy about your book, and I know you maybe might cringe or shirk from this kind of idea, but I feel like it's kind of almost going back to an ancient and naive world, barbarous but honest approach to life, which is multifarious and dynamic and flowery in a way that our modern monolithic material existence cannot possibly comprehend. Which is something I deeply enjoyed about your book, and I eagerly wait for the third book in the series to come out, or because, especially to see how it develops, because of just simply the dynamism of the universe that you are kind of starting to develop. Of course, we're early days on into your project, but to say that, like, I read widely in fiction, and especially science fiction, big fan of Heinlein, of course, but it feels like no other experience of life, except for maybe, let's say, Dune, the Dune series, like, approximates any of this kind of, like, I don't know, just kind of vitalism, this kind of differentiation of life, and how that would play out in the interactions between these different elements. I don't know. You let me know how you feel about that.
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate the compliment. You're gassing me up too much. It's gonna force me to have to go and really pick apart my writing for the third book. Actually, to be honest, I wrote the second book. I think I wrote 3 versions of the book before I decided on the last one. And the funny story about the second book, and I don't think this is a big spoiler, but a huge influence for, like, as I said before, like I reference, like there's like Vedic, ancient Hindu esotericism, like locked into the story. Like if, for instance, like samsara exists in BASK in a way, and there's a reason why it comes up later, especially with the kind of the cycle of the gods and the fallen gods. But the element of the second book, the huge inspiration was actually, if anyone's familiar with it, Wild Country, the Rajneeshis. That was a huge inspiration. Actually, that there's a kind of a shameless, like the Paragon, the Master Who Sleeps. Like there's definitely a huge influence on that. I mean, it's one of my favorite documentaries. So I definitely liked the idea of putting that on there, where there, like you said, there's the multifaceted, and then every time a culture attempts at becoming monolithic, and doesn't understand or respect the means in which the world operates, it crumbles. And that even happens with, there's the Psiotians, which they don't really come up until a lot later. the desert people, but they're like hyper Egyptians, and even they suffer from the same They suffer from a different cataclysm, but they suffer from the same kind of thing. I guess like the best way to describe it is like this kind of transience and entropy, which is found. If you haven't read Jack Vance, I would highly recommend reading Jack Vance. His Dying Earth series is by far, bar none, probably one of the best. Sam Hyde, I actually found out, is a huge fan of Jack Vance, which is awesome. Jack Vance has a kind of his prose is very vivid, and it's not as decorative as you might describe it. He doesn't fit a lot of the tropes that you might find in a lot of science fiction, where he does this kind of like ironic kind of tone that sort of it kind of juxtaposes the beauty and decay of this kind of dying Earth kind of world, where these like characters are essentially like kind of being introduced to these strange environmental, like these strange societies that have like kind of messed with technology or science, and it often leads to the destruction. That's why I said the wizards, like the Saturnon, was a direct, the influence of that was that the wizards are essentially like they're nerds. They're the nerd that thinks they're smarter than everyone else, and they want to like upload their consciousness or whatever it is, and it ends up completely frying them.
Sounds familiar, huh?
there is that element is definitely persistent in bat, and I'm fully like I fully embrace it. Like that is a huge element of that, which is, I mean that becomes like one of the main themes too. Like later on is like with the Godwalkers, which is that they essentially are almost like an AI race. They are 100% were able to manipulate and master elements in physicality of the world, and they've been reduced essentially to becoming this like ageless, primordial, but completely toothless society that like exists. Like they live in like little Pokemon orbs and have to be carried around by like mentally challenged midgets that that like walk around and like look at the world from this like rosy colored lens. I'm thinking, what's the Little Fist from the first book? That's kind of where I wanted to kind of superimpose these like sort of crude characters with these like encompassing ideas, like you said, like vitalism or of like the societal decay. But that's the one thing I've read a lot of science fiction, and that was the one thing I found like lacking in, which was science fiction sometimes it should take itself seriously, but should also not, if it wants to talk, like you said at the very beginning, which I wish I kind of spoke about this earlier, but science fiction and fantasy should be a vessel or a vehicle for greater ideas. And it should not be used for, like, I think that the reason why a lot of people don't like, it's kind of had like science fiction and fantasy has kind of had like this sort of like, it's trended up and down, especially like more down, I'd say, in recent years. And you had like the young adult fiction, which we could get into, but like the whole young adult fiction genre sort of kind of peaked, I'd say, like the early 2000s, especially with like things like Aragon or Harry Potter, the Maze Runner, Hunger Games, all this different stuff. Like it really took off, and it had a huge impact, especially if you were born in the 90s or late 80s. Like you probably read these books, and you probably really loved them. And those books had like a lot of mythological underpinnings to them. I'd say that definitely the post-apocalyptic, like the more of like the Hunger Games stuff, really kind of dived more into the post-apocalyptic slash like like misery porn. I don't know. There's not like a really great word to describe it.
Like the road, so to speak, kind of thing.
Yeah, it's kind of like that's like the Hunger Games is like the child's version of the road, essentially. At least the road is written extremely well, and it makes you rethink about like survivalism. but that like that kind of trend of fiction has sort of gone down. I think it's because like, let's be honest, like there's an interesting theme here with like things like Dune becoming like remade, like in film, like it becoming this massive, huge hit, because Dune, like the underpinning elements are like, it's like polygamy, world domination. It touches on things like even on like race. It touches on briefly on like technology and on the control mechanisms of society. about the worship of like demigod, like prophet people. These are all things that are very like anti-liberal philosophies that like would not fit in at all with like the modern day, but yet it's like upheld because of the vehicle it's being used in, which is in science fiction. It's so in another world, Paul Atreides exists outside of our universe. He isn't Donald Trump. He's somewhere very, very far away, and for some reason people can like disassociate, and they can kind of like leap into that world and suddenly be like, yeah, I'm okay with Belisan Al-Gaid as long as he's not ruling my country.
Well,
You know what I mean? It's
I mean that's the beauty of science fiction is that, like I said at the beginning, it allows for people with a priori valuations to put that aside for a second and take things as they come via the vehicle of the story, right? And so it's interesting to me because what it does is it reaches beyond the let's say the structures or limitations of our time, and I believe the reason why they're being remade in our time is because people are sick of. I mean, let's just be real here. Like, we're not living in great times. We're not living in times in which we can be proud of, per se. Like, everyone is dissatisfied. The rates of depression are skyrocketing. Nobody wants to hear stories about weakness and basically decrepitude and hopelessness. They want to hear stories, and to say nothing, of course, the fact that a lot of this sclerotic environment which we find on today is caused by moral suppositions which are asphyxiating us spiritually. And I think the interesting thing about Dune is, and the reason why it's so popular amongst everyone, is because of the fact that it's an unrepentant affirmation of a kind of story of will to power. It's a kind of Renaissance Italy environment, writ into the stars, right? A galactic version of that. And I enjoy that deeply because, and I think most people enjoy that deeply, and why they will enjoy your stories, because it is in itself a manifestation of the will to power without any kind of concept of good versus evil, but rather a kind of triumph of the will in, the story of Paul Atreides. But also at the same time, we can also see that it's a, conflict of power, conflict of will between other factions, which each have their own kind of civilizational, spiritual feeling for the universe, which is just as valid as each other, and that the universe, I guess, reveals its justice in the conflict and victor, or the triumph of the conflict between those different, I guess, kingdoms, or polities within the empire itself, I guess the universe of Dune, and which is completely different, right? And obviously I've kept myself in talking about High because the substance of that story is completely different from yours, and obviously it's different from Dune. But the same thing applies to Heinlein as well, is that it is kind of the one time that Americans are able to see a world beyond an idealized version of the United States that transports us into a future which allows us to not have to be the way that we unfortunately are kind of stuck in right now. And so, I don't know, going all the way back though, I agree with you, and I think the reason why stories like Dune are being proliferated is because man at base, just like Nietzsche would always say, is will to power, right? And that people are yearning for strength, strong stories, strong thoughts, strong actions, and ultimately that's what they'll get from Dune, but I think they'll get from your story, is that it's just strength, and the story of strength, and the battle for strength, and the battle for victory, but it's also not about the end goal, it's not about the end state, so to speak, it's about the journey, it's about the experience in life, the existential questions of one's soul, and the effusion of that kind of vision, aesthetic vision of life, kind of playing out, which is absolutely the greatest thing to have come across, frankly, my personal library in a very long time. But just kind of going off here, I know you like Jack Vance, and I think you obviously like Cormac McCarthy to a certain extent. Yeah, sorry, our comms got jammed once again. So we were just talking about authors that you were inspired by, and aside from Jack Vance and what's the other one? Freaking McCormick McCarthy. You said that you had another one that kind of really inspired you.
Yeah, so there's a couple of them. The first one I would name is Robert E. Howard has been massively influential. I've mentioned him before, and I talked about him a lot on Twitter, but Robert E. Howard truly is like one of the greats of our time. He nailed what you were talking about earlier about how like different civilizations kind of interact with one another, and like in a kind of the Hellenic world, and how that would be depicted in like science fiction is absolutely phenomenal. I recommend, like, I really like there's a longer story called The Hour of the Dragon, which was kind of his only attempt at doing almost like, it wasn't novelesque by any means, but it's definitely like the longest version of his stories. You could start there, or you go to other ones. Robert Howard is phenomenal. I would say also the two other authors probably that influenced me the most is Bernard Cornwell and Glenn Cook. I know I've told you about Glenn Cook, but Bernard Cornwell wrote different, like he's written mini series. One of them, like my favorite, is the Burning Land Saga. There's also the Archer's Tale, and they're gritty, but they're not, I would not say that they try too hard at being gritty or overly realistic. They're just very, like, much of the times, like it's told exactly probably how it would have been at that time. The Burning Land Saga is like the influence for the TV show The Last Kingdom. If anyone's seen that, it's like a loose. It follows the plot almost exactly, like beat by beat, but it's obviously just it's a TV rendition. It's fairly good. It's enjoyable, but the books are far way better. The main character Uhtred Ragnarsson is he's a warlord through and through, and he makes no apologies for being a pagan living in early Anglo-Saxon, pre-England, essentially. And then the other author is Glenn Cook. Glenn Cook writes military fantasy. He wrote The Black Company and several other series. There's another author on Twitter, Conan Esquire. Me and him have had cigars and martinis and talked about Glenn Cook for hours and hours. He's absolutely, if you have the tolerance to read his prose is very short, has lots of brevity. It is not flowery at all. It's not Tolkien. There's no like multi-pages describing a hill or a forest. It just goes right into it and kind of assumes that you're following this saga of these. Essentially, Glenn Cook was a Vietnam vet that ended up writing a military fantasy where he kind of attempts to look at how good and evil would be portrayed in a sort of like a battle for good and evil between an evil queen with like sorcerer underlings and then a mercenary company, aka the Black Company, serving her, fighting against like what are called the Rebel and the White Rose, which are just basically like the quote good guys. And it's incredible. It's well written, and I think those influences definitely they kind of lean more on the Nietzschean morality, which I think it's more real. I read those books and I end up writing BASK and thinking like, how would I want to write these? And I think that's where I would say I kind of fall away from other science fiction writers, where other science fiction writers and fantasy writers really try to inject a lot of morality into their stories. And I think it's pointless. Right. I think the world is, I think the world has different moralities, but I think it's also a very amoral place. And it's fun to kind of dive into and feel like you're the good guy or whatnot. And there's obviously heroism still. You can have heroism without trying to have the moral high ground.
Right.
But I think that sort of like we were talking about earlier about like Dune and how these other writers like Robert E. Howard or Glenn Cook, they don't waste time holding your hand and telling you that you're the good guy. They go into the stories and kind of describe these very dynamic, very real characters that I would say it makes you. I mean, for me, it turns the page because it's far more relatable to somebody like me, a 30-year-old who runs a company that has to constantly deal with horrific people on a day-to-day basis that are just self-interested, self-motivated people. That I relate to that way more than I'd ever relate to somebody telling me like, well, there's just a very evil, bald guy with no nose who wants to kill all the children at my high school, aka Hogwarts. So
yeah, it's interesting because I mean, the real world has all the moral fixtures of a street fight. And what I mean by that is maybe there are
Well
some.
put. That's very well put.
Yeah, exactly. There may
That.
be some kind of gentleman's rules, but there's nothing stopping your enemy from taking out a handgun and blasting your face off. So, this is kind of something that I always feel that hampers or hinders a lot of people, because I think that fiction is more impactful than philosophy or even science in the sculpting of the human mind. It sculpts the zeitgeist, the paradigm, the lens under which someone sees the world and acts in it. And so much about morality is really about hindering oneself as opposed to providing a boon to action. What I find so enjoyable about your book is precisely that it doesn't talk about what we don't do, and talks more about like what one does and seeks to do, which is a very attacking, aggressive kind of philosophy rather than a kind of defensive slash self police.
Reactionary.
Yes,
It's
precisely.
It's reactionary. There's moral every story I can think of, besides the elusive and very well written few. Most of them are moral reactionaries, where
Yes.
there's some villain or something that's imposing their will upon the world, and everyone has a moral pro clutching in reaction to it, saying, "Oh, you can't do that." And that's exactly what It's funny in that it's funny because that's quite literally. In many ways, there's people recoil. George R. R. Martin's Game of Thrones. People recoil that. Of course, I don't. I'm not saying. I think that he's. I think he's a spiritual goblin, but I also believe that he's not a bad writer. He's technically a very good writer, by all accounts. I have to give him credit for that, although he'll never finish his books. But the fact that the main characters that impose their will on the world are also the protagonists in Game of Thrones, and people are able to kind of discard their, whatever you want to call it, like their moral cloaks or their their liberal proclivities to being the good person, or trying to look like the good person, when in the story they're fascinated with like Daenerys Targaryen, who essentially is just a warlord with a really long blonde hair and a pretty face and boobs. Like, that's literally all she is.
Right.
Now I have to ask you a question though, because you're talking about like the book. Which book of BASK are you referring to, or which one that represents this best to you? Because I'm curious now. We haven't really gone into
personally,
it.
I think the one that actually enthused me the most and was what caused me to reach out to you was Gemini, right? And I know that like many of the themes here, and I'm conflating and confusing, one book with the other. But I feel like your second book gave more context to the first. But that is exactly what I'm kind of trying to get at here. And personally, the interesting thing is that for as much as, let's go back to George R. R. Martin, he's talking about the Game of Thrones, and of course a lot of people are recoil in shock regarding the motivations of the great princes of that story. But remember that George R. R. Martin basically stole much of his story from the War of Roses in Great Britain,
Mm-hmm.
or not then Great Britain, but the Kingdom of England, right? And the story
Right.
of fighting for the throne. And to be frank with you, like I think the challenge with fiction, or rather what people perceive fiction to be completely fantastical, frivolous, and beyond reality, the actual evocative and interesting fiction is based on reality. And like I said before, reality has all the morals of a street fight. And, there may be conventions and mores and, aspirations that animate as ideals for certain factions. So in the story of George R. R. Martin, it's the story of like Daenerys Targaryen, doing her little like, abolitionist crap. But like, there's that, and then of course there's the traditionalism of the northern factions, and this and that and the other thing. And I think frankly that my favorite character in that entire story is the head of the what's the midget's dad's name again?
Oh, Lannister.
Yeah, Tywin Lannister.
Oh, Tywin Lannister. Yeah, that's so funny. He's literally my favorite character as well. He literally, I watch these YouTube essays that are like, why Tywin Lannister won Westeros, and I'm like, I already knew that when I first watched it.
Yeah,
but they did him very well.
Yeah, he's bad. He's evil. But remember, it's him that actually guarantees the unity and structure and power of Westeros, right? And it's actually his demise that is coincided with the flux or the stasis of that polity, which falls under the influence of the Targaryens once again. So it's curious to me, I guess going back to the story here that we're talking about, and I don't want to spoil it for the legionaries out there. I want them to buy it and read it, right? But to me, what I enjoy about your story is this agnosticism regarding morals and this kind of affirmation of life in and of itself. I don't want to give away too much because that's the thing is I don't like listening to podcasts referring to stories and tell them about the stories, and then people are enthused to pick up the book and then they read it and they're like, well, I already knew everything about this. Well, this kind of deflates. It's like watching the movie before reading the book. It's like, don't do that.
How about this? Maybe which character / which because there's many characters. Which one are you referring to? So I know what you're talking about.
Dude. Okay. So
which timeline?
Okay.
I'm really gonna challenge you on this one. Did you really read the book?
Dude, I have my notes here. One second. Stand by. All right, Legionnaires. Again, we got freaking cut off here. I was put on the spot, and unfortunately, some fate intervened. But no, to talk about the characters here, it was actually Savant Erudite that actually was the most interesting part of me, and I don't want a part of the story. And this is in the Mind Saturnine, so the second half, the second installation here. So there's part 2, and it's Floods of Nowhere, and in his kind of interaction with Bull, and in his kind of, let's say, moral quandary, or not even moral quandary, but the quandary of the internal interests of what he wants, right? He's
having an existential crisis is what's happening.
Exactly. And so he's kind of, and it was really telling here, because what was happening is that he reveals himself to be a dynamic character in which he balances the interests of himself, but the interests of what he considers to be the greater individuated, he's just an individuated part of his people. And I guess I wanted to ask you, that is precisely the kind of interesting part that I think we find all of ourselves into in this life, where we're kind of balancing the interests of multiple different people without betraying oneself, which is, of course, betraying one's greater kind of, let's say, nation, whatever it may be. And so he's speaking to Bull, and there's this really telling part here in the book, and it says, and Savat thought his punishment harsh. His history aside, he was functionally human as any other, bereft only of his gifts. To be cursed, to isolate from his kind forever, suicide would be preferable. And so, I don't know, for me, this was my favorite kind of, let's say, pitch of the story. But of course, Legionaries, I'd highly recommend you read. But, I wanted you to kind of elucidate as to what the circumstances of, this exchange were, and what was your motivation behind trying to actually, show this part of, Erudite himself.
Okay, now you're putting me on the spot. I think that the main kind of, as I'm trying to remember, it's been a little while since I wrote that, but essentially Savant is going through this existential crisis where he's been exiled, and he comes upon essentially basically another genius. So I'm as a writer, I'm shameless in my sort of the tropes I like to use. My tropes come up a lot. In fact, actually, the other book I'm writing currently right now that'll be published this summer, which is more of a Dune meets Game of Thrones. It's a fantasy story. It's a very kind of grimdark fantasy / military fantasy. I'll talk about it later. But I like to use parallels and duality. So I like to use two different characters contrasting each other, but having like one similarity, because that helps also kind of drive. Like, I mean, the story for me, Savant needed to be able to see another. I mean, his name Savant, erudite. Like he's even though he's like a kind of like a middling like Saturn in his own like right, he also is like considered to like other people to be like he's like a genius. And having him kind of juxtapositions next to another genius, which is Boole, who is basically like a this crazy inventor. I wanted to have that kind of revelation where he realized that he is just, as a human, but also that like he has this great moral quandary, which is that like he has to like figure out basically what is more important, like his individual pursuits, which I think that like the hubris of scientists and people that are developing technology in our day, that they don't really ever have that, like they never second guess themselves. Like they never think like, do I just want to kind of create this like artificial, like I said, AI? I want to like replicate some kind of a pseudo artificial intelligence to replace people. Should I do that, or is that a good idea, or whatever? And that's why I wanted to have like a really real, like somebody that is like that, but it's had this kind of challenge and this crisis, actually kind of question their own drives and motivation. And the other part of that too, obviously, is that like both of those characters encounter a third one, and that is like essentially like they're like Prometheus. They're basically encountering the creation of fire. So, and that obviously plays on later on the story. So that's kind of like where I wanted to write. Like that's where that came from. And I think that if I want to write something that has meaning, and if I want to write, how would you actually feel if you're this very intelligent person that got exiled? Like, how would you deal with that? And then learning that there's a big facade. I think that I'd have a pretty big moral quandary, or I'd be questioning my own existence after that point as well. So that's kind of where that came from. And also just the fact that like the second book is pretty self-evident. Like there are people that, these Saturn, these like sort of like astral sorcerers that think that they're a lot smarter than they are, and they really aren't. And that's kind of the same thing as our modern day scientists. They think they're a lot smarter than they are. And then, then you have one barbarian that throws a rock in the gears, and suddenly the whole machine just collapses in on itself.
No, exactly. And it's interesting because I like your story. I mean, beyond simply the questions of, the moral self-examination, but, for instance, if you zoom forward here a little bit in the story, you have Noontak, right? And, talking about like stories of like loyalty and love and pacts of kind of greater affinity. You know what I mean? So, for instance, talking about oaths, for instance, and oaths in which he gave, others, and like there's some very interesting names here because it might sound a little bit strange to you legionaries listening, but all of these are kind of dynamics which are eternal principles which face not simply us, but also what makes to me the most, I guess, evocative element of your storytelling is kind of these eternal principles played out in a kind of not amoral world, but supra petty moralism, which gets at the heart of all morals itself: loyalty, kindred spirits, and the concept of oaths and dedication. And so I guess the reason why I'm kind of bringing this up here is that I wanted to ask you the following. What is it that you wanted to give to your audience as a kind of outro here to when they read Mind Saturnine and Gemini? What is it that you wanted from the BASK series to elicit in your readership and into port back into our time?
Good question. It's a very good question. Let me think about this for a second. Well, for one, I mean, I want everyone to buy the book.
And read it.
I need line to go up.
Yeah.
Every writer that pretends like no. I mean, I really don't write for. I mean, as much as like I think like if you ask me 15 years ago why I wanted to write, I'd probably tell you like, oh, I want to write to sell a lot of books and make money. And the reality is you don't make a lot of money as a writer. And this for me really is a passion project. I have a whole separate company I run, and I don't need to write, but I feel the desire to. And actually that's why I started writing recently a lot, and really trying to put out a book, at least 1 or 2 books this year, is because I felt the compulsion that, hey, you only have so much time on this earth. Like you if you have a good idea, you really need to work on it. You really need to put it out there. There's no excuse. So I give myself that kind of timeline, but I think what I want to elucidate and what I want to give to the reader, for what I want to give them the vitality. I want to kind of combat the ideas. This is a direct conflict. I want to combat the ideas of nihilism, of sort of the embrace of moral decay of things like Game of Thrones, where it's embracing this sort of anti-trope or the anti-narrative, the heroes that are all 4'11" women that can beat up the bad guys. Like I want to combat that because it leads nowhere. It leads to just more decay. And I don't think it's necessarily moral decay. I think societal decay. I want to give people something that is a more of a fire, that they read something that's a totally off the wall, something that they've never seen before. BASK is on purpose. I make BASK obscure. It's obscurest on purpose. There's no reason. I wouldn't have to. I could make things more relatable and more Earth-like if I wanted to, and I don't want to. I want to make it strange and bizarre, and I want to make it dystopian for the reasons that, like, I want people to like read it and feel like that they can be kind of brought into this other world and have some inspiration on how they should view technology. I want people to view technology in a different way. That's how I view it. And as much as I could be like I could be like a total, I don't even call it like a hippie or like regressionist into nature and divorce myself from all technology and become I'm trying to think of what the word is, like not like a troglodyte, but
a Luddite.
A Luddite. Yeah, a Luddite. I could become a Luddite. I think there's also the very real future that we're going to have. I mean, we have technology until, if we don't have technology anymore, then you and I will not be having these conversations. But I think that if we're going to approach the future in a sort of way that's not, we do need to have kind of more of a Dune like approach to things. Maybe not necessarily just like Dune, but we need to have this fervent desire to have a strong will. I guess really that what it boils down to. It's a will to power. It's a desire to understand technology. I think it's to not worship technology. I think that men need to be as good with their primitive instincts as they should also recognize and understand technology. And that does come up later in the story. Like technology will come up later where there are certain characters that are kind of more primitive that start to understand the technology because instinctually they can, but they also recognize the destructive powers that come from letting that replace you, and becoming one with the machine culture is to become death. So I think that's where it boils down to.
So it's interesting. In a certain way, and I remember this since the beginning, it's basically flexible means with vitalistic, naturalistic, idealist ends, right? So basically, technical should always be in the service of the natural as opposed to vice versa. Well, anyway, Legionaries, Thank you so much, Claw, for coming on. I really do appreciate it. And you Legionaries out there should check it out. I'm going to have in the show notes under, right, the transmission notes. You buy the BASK series books, which the third one should be coming out, this year?
Yeah. Perfect. So, it'll be coming out, I think, in the fall. I'm planning on fall. Like I said, I am writing another book right now. It's not necessarily in the same vein as BASK, but if you guys are interested, it's going to be the working title right now is Pray for the Birds. And it's going to be a short series called The Sand Marches. It's like I said, Dune meets Game of Thrones. It's more of like a military fantasy, but I think that people like Glenn Cook, or if they like my writing already, they'll probably enjoy it. And then, the next book, BASK book, will be well on its way. Doom Crusader is book number 3.
Kill.
And that'll be hopefully out by fall. But if you follow me on Twitter, I'm sure I'll be giving out more updates as they come. So,
and I'll make sure to add your handle there in the transmission notes for the Legionaries in addition. So
awesome.
Go ahead and buy the Gemini of the Sleeping Gods and mine Saturnine, so that way we're all sped up. And without further ado, thank you so much, Claw. And this is the War Room with General Lance and Sergeant Barnes signing off. Oh!